All right, I think we can start. I will put the link to the YouTube broadcast in the chat if you want to share that. Um, we will start with a sad announcement, namely that Dwight Lewis cannot make it today. We're hoping that maybe we can reschedule his talk for the summer if we have a summer series. So what we're going to do is we're going to have Jonathan Edge's talk for an hour and end early. Right, so our talk today will be in search of Zera Yacob on an early modern Ethiopian philosopher and the question of whether he existed. Jonathan, you have the floor.
Unmute. Hi, can everyone hear me? Yeah, excellent. So firstly, yeah, thanks for having me here at the Princeton-Bucharest seminar. I've been coming to the seminar for I think sort of 6 months or so, and I've already heard so many sort of fantastic and eye-opening talks. It's a privilege, and also to be speaking to so many people. I can see from the participants list who I've been reading since my undergrad days. My background is in philosophy. I did the BPhil in philosophy at Oxford before moving to this sort of project now, which is being done with 2 intellectual historians in a comparative literature department. So I'm looking forward to sort of having the conversations that you can only have in a room full of philosophers. So I'll just share my screen, get this presentation up. I've got lots of images in this presentation so that hopefully, even if what I'm saying stops becoming interesting, you'll have something to look at. So yeah, this is about Zera Yacob, a philosopher from Ethiopia, and I basically want to introduce you to this a fascinating and neglected text from the history of philosophy, to propose an interpretation of the philosophical system that's contained in the text, and to make some speculative suggestions about how we might understand early modern rationalism in a global key. I then want to introduce you to a kind of philological detective story concerning this text, and then to think about what all of this might mean for thinking about the history of philosophy, especially the writing of the history of philosophy in a global orientation. So the first bit is just going to be beginning with the Hatäta Zera Yacob itself, and in particular with the discovery of the manuscript. So the manuscript is discovered in 1852 by a man named Giusto d'Urbino, who's a very reluctant Capuchin missionary in northern Ethiopia. He's part of a mission to evangelize the Oromo people of southern Ethiopia, but in fact refuses to leave the town he's staying in northern Ethiopia, instead remaining there to study the languages of northern Ethiopia and to translate missionary propaganda into these local languages. Another thing that he's doing while he's there is he's acquiring texts to send back to Europe, which he copies with the help of local scribes. He's sending these back to his patron, the Irish Basque geographer, linguist, explorer, collector, Anthony Dabadi, who's collecting the largest corpus of Ethiopian manuscript in Europe at the time, which is sort of intended to be the basis for a kind of new discipline of Ethiopian studies, of kind of on the model of Egyptology and Assyriology and the other sort of new disciplines which were popping up throughout the 19th century. Now, d'Urbino is expelled from the country when King Tewodros, the first king of modern Ethiopia, comes to power, and he's forced to send these documents back via Cairo. The manuscripts arrive back in Paris at an unknown date, and when Dabadi dies, his collection of Ethiopian manuscripts, as well as his massive neo-Gothic Pyrenean chateau, are bequeathed to the Académie des Sciences in 1902. Meanwhile, instead of returning with the manuscripts to Europe, d'Urbino wants to return to Ethiopia and dies of malaria in Khartoum in 1856, I believe. But to give some of the sort of background of the sort of world that went into creating this particular text, so it's written in Ge'ez. Ge'ez is an Ethio-Semitic language related very closely to the other Ethio-Semitic languages of contemporary Ethiopia, so Amharic, Guraji, Harari, Tigrinya, amongst others, and more distantly, of course, to Hebrew and Arabic. It's a dead language in the sense that it isn't spoken as a mother tongue by anyone anymore. It was the living language of the Aksumite Empire, which monopolized trade in the late antique period between Rome and Egypt and India, and which had very sort of close cultural contacts with the Greek world. So there's Greek coinage, there's in the Periplus of Erythrea, recordings of King Ezana, of the Ezana stele. This is the sort of the Rosetta Stone of Ethiopia, with the Gers language, Sabaean and Greek on this side here. And one of the major sort of imports during this period is Christianity. Ethiopia is one of the first Christian kingdoms. And even after Gers stops being spoken as the living language of the Ethiopian, of the Aksumite Empire, it continues to be the liturgical language and remains today the liturgical language of the Ethiopian and Orthodox churches, as well as the Beta Israel community. And the literature in Gers is incredibly rich and varied. In addition to religious works, there are chronicles, all sorts of historical writings, astronomical treatises, magic scrolls. And for our purposes, I think in particular, there are translations of broadly construed philosophical works. They mostly come from, well, initially Greek from the Byzantine Empire, and then later from Christian Arabic sources. There's the Physalogos, a work of nature mysticism, and the Book of Wise Philosophers, which is a compendium of philosophical maxims from Ethiopian saints, from biblical figures, and from figures who were curiously called Aflaton, Sicrat, and Abract, who are Plato, Socrates, and Hippocrates. And these texts would have been translated probably in the monasteries. On the right, we've got a scribe here copying out texts in Gers. And the sort of traditional system of education, so the traditional sort of emphases of Ethiopian intellectual life in this sense. So it begins with education in Gers through the reciting of chants, the Zimmer, progresses through grammatical studies, the Salsa or the ladder, and culminates in the composition of kine poetry, which is a sort of special, very playful form of poetry, which riffs off sort of double meanings and philosophical ambiguities. And then a particular form of biblical hermeneutics, where different interpretations of scripture are studied. So if that's the sort of intellectual context, some of the political context, which is really important for this work, are the wars of religion in 17th century Ethiopia. So the two major powers here this is Highland Christian Ethiopia, and on the right, the Adal Sultanate. The Adal Sultanate's mostly a series of nomadic tribes, which are unified by a charismatic warrior king, Ahmed Granya, Ahmed the left-handed, who with Ottoman firepower begin to push up into the Highland Ethiopia, which was traditionally a kind of fortress against invaders from all sides, and begin to sort of devastate the countryside and take over in the end almost 3/4 of the empire. The Ethiopians, faced with this kind of existential threat, send off for aid to European kings who they'd long been in contact over due to Western European myths of Prester John, a king in the east, who would sort of join them, and they were fascinated in this idea that sort of migrated from somewhere in Asia to the idea of a Christian king who was going to help them reclaim Jerusalem. But the people who eventually answered this call, the Portuguese, were probably at least as interested in trade in the Indian Ocean and with their competitions with the Ottomans. It's really one theatre of a much larger, one of the first global proxy wars, which takes place in the Mediterranean, in India, and in here. And eventually, Portuguese army led by the son of Vasco da Gama, Cristóvão da Gama, eventually help the Ethiopians win, but at the cost of a sort of major decline for both empires. And at immediately after this war finishes, the trade, the intercontinental traffic in musketmen is replaced by a traffic in missionaries, and the Jesuits in particular, who have been founded not very long ago, begin to gain more influence at court. They convert the Ethiopian emperor, and a religious civil war breaks out when the emperor tries to impose his new religion on the population. So that's sort of some of the background to the text itself that we're gonna look into now. And the first sort of thing to note is that the text is an autobiographical treatise. It covers the entirety of its protagonist's long life from 1599 to 1692, which, you know, as we can tell, makes him a contemporary of most of the great 17th century philosophers, but particularly close to Descartes, the European philosopher with which he's most often compared. And because it's an autobiography, I'm going to try and let Zera Yacob really speak as much as possible. And so we'll begin with one of the opening lines, which is, "My native land was amongst the priests of Axum, but I was born from a poor worker in the land of the priests of Axum." The next section sort of recounts his early education up until the point that he is at the stage of studying the biblical hermeneutics, where he comes into contact with foreign ideas from the Jesuits for the first time. He writes, "I studied sacred books, how the Ferengi, the Europeans, interpret them, and how the Copt, the Ethiopian teachers, interpret them. Often their interpretation was not in harmony with my reason, so I just kept silent and hid all the thoughts in my heart." This is the first kind of indication that we have of a philosophical temperament. He disagrees with these interpretations because they are not in harmony with his reason, and he chooses to kind of suspend judgment, or at least not to, you know, make explicit these objections, and hides all the thoughts in his heart. Needless to say, in the fraught political situation I outlined before, this doesn't make him particularly popular. And he writes next that the Europeans said these things and the Copts said these other things. I did not say this is good and this is bad. Rather, I said, all of this is good if we ourselves are good. They hated me because of this, since to the Copts I seemed like a European, and to the Europeans I seemed like a Copt. Now, this eventually gets him into some fairly serious trouble. He's denounced to the Ethiopian king, and he's forced to flee. He takes 3 ounces of gold, a book and a psalter, which he used for prayer, and fled during the night. While heading towards Shoa, a region in the south of Ethiopia, I found a wilderness. At the bottom of a high cliff, there was a cave, and I thought, I will stay here without anyone knowing. This is the kind of land. Yeah?
Jonathan, could you move closer to the microphone? People are saying that the sound is going in and out as you move.
Okay. I tell you what, I can move the microphone itself. Is that better? Ooh.
I think it's fine. It's just like the moving that sort of makes it oscillate. Okay.
Oh, okay. Okay. Hopefully this will be a bit easier. Good. Okay. Yeah. So what I've said up until now is, I think, fairly, you know, this is a statement of the historical fact and the things that he's particularly been talking about. But what I want to do in the next section is to offer something of an interpretation of the philosophy itself. And this is based on, so all of the quotes I'm using here are from a new unpublished translation by Professor Ralph Lee from the School of African and Oriental Studies. And I'm going to present this not in the order that Zera Yacob actually writes it, but so as to try and reconstruct something of his system, which means I'm going to be emphasizing the epistemology and the metaphysics, kind of at the expense of some of the things he says about ethics and social thoughts, beginning with what I take to be the motivations for this philosophical system. So he writes, I meditated all day on people's quarrels and wickedness, and on the wisdom of the Lord their creator, who keeps silent when they act wickedly in his name, persecute their neighbors, and kill their fellow countrymen. So war and exile, his particular circumstances are, it seems, the motivation for his system. The particular problems of human difference and conflict, and the prospects for resolving these disputes peacefully and intellectually drive it. You get the impression that the thing he's really worried about is, I'm not sure if you could call it a relativism, but a kind of manifold of these different conflicting human ideas, with might being the only thing that can possibly settle any differences between them. And it's this that I suggest moves him towards something that we might call a rationalism. And I think the best way to see how that begins is to think about the exile as having provoked a profound kind of doubt, the doubt that was already there in the skepticism of the Copt and the Ferengi, but which now extends to his own faith. So he asks, is all that is written in the sacred books true? I thought a lot, and in spite of this, I did not understand. And I said, I will go and I will ask learned people and deep thinkers, and they will tell me the truth. So of course, the idea that the philosophical inquiry begins with doubt is one of the reasons that people have been so keen to draw the Descartes analogy. But it's also noting that there's this kind of Socratic conceit here as well. I will go and ask the learned people and deep thinkers, they'll surely tell me. But he is, I mean, in his material circumstances, he's much more like the Cartesian solitary thinker. He's by himself in this cave. He has to sort of presume a general kind of answer to this question. And the general kind of response he believes that you will get to questions like this is that people will answer what is already present in their hearts. In fact, all men say, my religion is correct, and those who believe another religion believe falsely, and they are enemies of God. If they argued the case like this, who would be the judge? So we get this wide variety of positions. Each thinks his own is correct and doesn't allow or admit the reasoning, the premises of others. Inevitably, they come into bitter conflict. And the reason, you know, he's asking who would be the judge. In many cases, it seems obvious who the judge would be, namely God. But of course, when precisely what is at stake are the different religious conceptions, this doesn't seem like such a helpful thing to appeal to. Nevertheless, he thinks there has to be some answer, because my religion seems true to me, so does another's religion seem true to him. Truth, however, is unique. So truth is unique. The question is, how do we get there? How do we understand the truth? Who is going to be the judge of this truth? The judge, I'm going to suggest, is going to be none other than a faculty of reason, a divinely endowed human faculty akin to vision, which allows us to see literally what is, well, quite literally, allows us to see what is right and wrong, what is true and false. And it's for this reason that I suggest, or that I term him a rationalist. The fundamental problem of his philosophy, these problems of human difference, demand an answer in terms of a faculty of human reason. And in this slide, hopefully I'll sort of give some more substance to what this is supposed to entail. He writes, to the one who searches out, truth will immediately be, or will quickly be revealed, because the one who inquires with the pure reason the Creator has put into the human heart to see the rules and laws of creation will find the truth. Now, one thing to note here is that when he talks about the human heart, this has got a very different metaphorical sense to what we might have. Indeed, the root of the term for reason or intelligence or comprehension in these comes from the same root as heart. It's lab. The heart is the center of cognition and of thought in all of these contexts. In one of the only, I think, three monographs on the philosophy of Zera Yacob in English, Tewodros Kiros, an Eritrean philosopher, puts a lot of emphasis on what he calls the rationality of the human heart. And a lot of what I'm going to say later is going to rely on some of the sort of linguistic points around that. The other thing is that there's a lot of emphasis on vision and seeing. It's my mouse gone. Trying to get to the next quote. Oh dear. Okay, my mouse has run out of battery, so I'm going to have to try it with this. Sorry, can you all still see the presentation?
We can still see it, but full information, some people are still complaining about the sound in the chat.
Oh dear. Okay. I don't know what I can do about the sound, unfortunately.
Yeah, if everyone could just have their volume to the maximum, I can hear you fine. It varies a little, but it's basically fine. Okay. So
I'll try and speak directly towards the microphone at least, see if that helps. Okay, so in addition to this point about the idea of the etymology of reason and the heart, we also see that there are the repetition of these same metaphors of vision. The Creator put into the heart of humans the light of intelligence, that they may see good and evil, recognize what is and is not their duty, and distinguish the truth from a lie. And how by your light, O Lord, we see light. Biblical quote. And if we were to see this light of our intelligence, what is our duty? It cannot deceive us, because our Creator gave us this light that we may be saved by it, and not that we may be destroyed. And all that the light of our intelligence shows us is from the fountain of truth. But what people say to us is from the fountain of lies. And our intelligence affirms to us that all the Creator has established is right. So I'll go maybe over this one in the interest of time, but just briefly to sort of say, it seems like from these quotes we have an account of a faculty, a divinely endowed faculty that allows us to distinguish good from bad, right from wrong. It's essentially both epistemic and ethical in that sense. And the criteria for both of them is naturalness. What is good is natural, and what is natural is good because this is the way that God created the world. He's forced also in his interest in deception and in us getting things wrong, given that the one who seeks out truth, it will be quickly revealed. He has to come up with some sort of error theory, which would explain why, this isn't the case for many people. Hence, we've got this idea that, following the law of God is the thing that will get us there, and following the law of men who are lazy and who don't want to inquire is going to get in the way. And to see how he applies this notion of rationality, he applies it in what many Ethiopian scholars at least have found to be the most remarkable part of his system, which is a fairly stinging critique of established religion. So he writes that in the books of Moses are found detestable wisdom, which are not in harmony with the wisdom of Creator. What he has in mind here is, I think, that it's the criticism of the Mosaic purity laws, which ban menstruating women from joining in services. He says that this is a natural part of the reproductive cycle. Banning it is obviously against any sort of natural understanding of the laws of the Creator. He uses the same argument to criticize fasting. We're hungry equally on every single day, so why would there be some days we eat and some we don't? Criticizes slavery. God did not create one people for life and one for death, one for mercy and one for judgment, polygamy and the like. And he goes on, just these things I can mention only quickly, I suppose, but he comes up with a form of cosmological argument that many people have seen either the influence of Aquinas or of Islamic Kalam arguments hovering over. There's a theodicy, a justification of suffering in the world, and what seems to me at least a really remarkably Kantian argument for the immortality of the soul, claiming that the hope that sustains morality, the rationality that rules the world, could not be so were the soul not immortal. And finally, one that people might find slightly entertaining is he notes how much more he learned whilst living alone in a cave than when he was living with scholars. So the next thing that I want to think about is, if that is a summary of some of the philosophical thoughts he's had, how can we think about his place in the history of philosophy? What does it mean to think of an Ethiopian thinker as an early modern philosopher? So I'm not sure if I mentioned this before, but he's in the cave in the early 1630s, which means that he's composing this almost exactly the same time that Descartes is writing the Discours de la Méthode. And different commentators have taken different significance from this. So I'm going to show three quotes, the first of which comes from Claude Sumner, who was a Jesuit priest, the founder of the philosophy department at Addis Ababa University, the defender of the authenticity of this text, and the compiler of an incredible 5-volume work of Ethiopian philosophy. And he claims, he's also, the original translator of English, he claims that modern philosophy, in the sense of a personal, rationalistic, critical investigation, began in Ethiopia with Zera Yacob at the same time as in England and in France. And of course, this is quite a remarkable claim to make. This is not how many of us would have traditionally understood the emergence of modern philosophy. And I think it does demand, if this text is indeed from 17th century Ethiopia, a serious rethink of the global development of the history of philosophy. But we should be careful with this. The Hatäta Zera Yacob is not the beginning of a tradition in the same way as these French and English roots of them are. And we would do well to ask why that might be the case. Why is it that whereas there was a companion treatise which was published by one of the disciples of Zera Yacob, kind of developing his thought in the direction of a social ethics, there was not really this same wasn't the foundation of in the way that the works of Hobbes and Descartes were. And this is the same problem, I think, that's encountered in an essay called The African Enlightenment by Yacob, which claims that the highest ideals of Locke, Hume and Kant were proposed more than a century earlier by an Ethiopian in a cave. And I think that a lot of the things that he says in this essay are, very suggestive, but in some cases slightly underdetermined. A lot of the comparisons. So the idea is that Zera Yacob got there before Locke did on equality, or than Kant did on human dignity, or whatever else. But there's not really much interrogation of whether the terms we're using here are the same or not. Is reason the same as Leb? Is the same as cognition, or whatever else? Are these terms really equivalent? And I think, really what we need before any comparative work like that is going to be done is a Ger's philosophical lexicon, or a philosophical glossary, which is one thing that I'm going to be hopefully producing as part of the PhD project. But a third suggestion, which I found quite suggestive at the start, was in an essay from Chike Jeffers, where he suggests that it's worth classifying Zera Yacob as modern in terms of understanding the historical context as part of a evolving early modern world, which is obviously not just taking place in any one location. And what I want to suggest in the next couple of slides is that we would do very well to think about this text through the lens of what we might call a connected history of philosophy. So a connected history of philosophy, I've got a definition of here as, sorry, let me just close that, an approach to history that emphasizes the diffusion of the same patterns in different places with a focus on common material circumstances that are not just isolated developments, right? So it's a form of history that's pioneered by people like Sanjay Subrahmanyam, that Jonathan Ganeri, in his brilliant book, The Lost Age of Reason, begins to apply to philosophy, and that Justin Smith's doing all sorts of really interesting stuff with at the moment. And I think one reason that I came to this in terms of thinking about Zera Yacob is that in the Ethiopian context, it's essential. Thinking about isolated developments, the traditional historiography of Ethiopia has been, it's nicely summarized by that line from Gibbon about Ethiopia slumbering for near 1,000 years, forgetful of the world by which they were forgotten. And, really, if we do want to understand, and as recent scholarship has shown, if we're wanting to understand any part of intellectual, cultural, or political life there, we need to see it not only as something which is part of the Eastern Orthodox world, or the Horn of Africa, or on the peripheries of the Islamic world, part of the emerging, European world order. We need to see it as the sort of intersection of all of these. And what I want to ask is whether it might be fruitful to think of early modern rationalism or rationalist philosophy in this way. So here's how that might work. It's been sort of widely noted by a number of scholars that the 17th century is a period of crisis. People like Hobsbawm and Trevor Roper and Geoffrey Parker all sort of noting how there's a fairly widespread crisis which is responded to in various sort of regionally inflected ways. Subramaniam's work has shown how this can be a useful way of understanding intellectual history by examining the spread of millenarian ideas in 16th century Eurasia. And one suggestion would be that we could understand the development of early modern rationalism in a global key in this sort of way. So we have all over the world people who are responding to similar sort of problematics of the kind of human difference I described earlier, especially religious difference, religious conflicts, rooted in new encounters of people with global trade, of new ideas coming to challenge old beliefs, of attacks on superstitions with new intellectual resources and the like. And it seems to me that there can be the general idea of looking to a universal human faculty that everyone has equally, regardless of which one of these groups they're a part, that allows us to have some way of at least trying to settle these disputes, is the sort of thing that could be come up with in a lot of these different contexts individually. So maybe Zera Yacob is particularly responding to the Ethiopian wars of religion. He's writing in a language and with a particular intellectual history that determines the shape that will take. But maybe Descartes or Locke, or you take some other European figure who maybe we can read as doing the same, responding to similar sorts of problems on their own terms. I'll speculatively suggest that we might also read 17th century Mughal, the heir to the Mughal throne and philosopher Darishuko in the same sort of way. Maybe we don't have a rationalism so much as a syncretism here, but we have the idea that commonalities have to be found between these different groups, an intellectual response to civil strife. And the connected approach, I think, is important because instead of just having general comparative suggestions about, well, this, here's something Descartes says that's a bit like something that Zera Yacob says, we have to note what the similarities are. And one of the similarities are that Descartes was educated by Jesuits and Zera Yacob was in conversation with Jesuits. They may well have been reading similar sort of books, having the same sorts of arguments, particularly in the missionary context, engaging with Jesuit ideas of a sort of Prisia Theologia, of a wisdom which united all peoples in previous times and the like. We could note that Zera Yacob and Descartes are both responding to issues they have with superstitious beliefs and the like. And I just think, a connected approach gives us a way of being a little bit more historically specific than merely saying, here are two ideas that superficially seem similar, especially when that work's usually being done without the proper linguistic sort of comparisons. So moving on to the next part of it, I hope I'm not taking too long so far, which is the century of controversy. So we left the manuscript of the Hatäta Zera Yacob, at least, as it's arriving in Paris in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, where it remains today. And although Dabadi wasn't particularly interested in this text, the first scholars who come to consult his collection found it very interesting indeed. In particular, a Russian scholar named Boris Turayev was really, really interested by this. He was struck by it, wrote a translation into Russian and began lecturing at the Academy of St. Petersburg on two Abyssinian freethinkers. At the same time, on the other end of Europe, Enno Lippmann, who's just returned from an archaeological expedition in northern Ethiopia, writes a book called Ein einsamer Denker in Abyssinen, a lonely Abyssinian thinker, and begins to get the text to a wider audience by translating it into Latin. I had no idea that people were still translating works into Latin as a scholarly language in 1906, which is quite remarkable. It starts to get a wider exposure in Europe. People are very interested in it. I found articles on it in at least 5 different European languages, and it includes this really nice quote from Karl Anton Baumstark, the German philologist. The book is entitled To a Place of Honor in the Midst of the Most Important Confessions of World Literature on account of its simple strength, its deep, serene, and sure sincerity, which I think is something that anyone that reads the text will agree on. But where's the controversy? So the controversy is that in 1920, an Italian Orientalist named Carlo Conti Rossini writes an article which claims that the supposed discoverer of the text, Giusto d'Urbino, is in fact its secret author. I won't bore you with some of the specifics of the philological arguments, but one of the big points that he makes is a point that struck him and Lippmann and Turayev in common, which is the singularity of the text in the Ethiopian context. There's number one, the criticism of established religion, which you'd be hard pressed to find in a form like that anywhere else, as well as certain types of rationalistic argument. But whilst Turayev and Lippmann wanted to locate foreign influences, Lippmann thought that you could see Kalam arguments in the cosmological argument. Turayev somewhat quixotically thought that Zera Yacob got his ideas from Herbert of Cherbury, who I'd actually never heard of before. But Conti Rossini was the first one to really suggest that all of the ideas had to come from outside Ethiopia altogether. Ethiopian culture, according to him, one of the great Ethiopianists of the 20th century, according to him, was deeply authoritarian, dogmatic, without any space for the kind of free critical thought that's essential for rationalistic philosophy. Philosophy of this sort, real philosophy, is impossible in Ethiopia, according to him. He's not just saying that this work is a forgery, but that no such work would have been possible. And immediately following his work, this became the new scholarly consensus. Turayev and Lippmann changed their mind after reading his arguments. And this was the sort of state of affairs for about 50 years afterwards, until two Ethiopian scholars, Amsalo Akilu and Almeyahu Moj, come up with two arguments that claim that it couldn't have been Durbino. They claim that the type of gers would have required, decades of training to be able to get, that the type of biblical quotations were unthinkable. So the only text part of the Bible that's quoted is the Psalter, the Psalms of David. And this would have been very unusual for a 19th century Catholic missionary, but would have been par for the course for a 17th century Ethiopian scholar. And finally, I've already mentioned Claude Sumner, but the second and third volumes of his Ethiopian philosophy deal with these things and provide some more of the background that makes the text seem less utterly singular and unusual in an Ethiopian context. To bring this up to date, we kind of have two sides of the debate now, one which I'm slightly tongue-in-cheek calling the Jacobites, the people who believe in the authenticity of the text. There's Getachew Haile, the great living scholar of Ethiopian manuscript, who claims that whilst Durbino might have edited a work from a number of earlier sources, he doesn't think it's feasible that Durbino would have been the sole author of it. Ralph Lee, the new translator, Princeton's Wendy Belcher, also agree with this verdict. In italics underneath are a list of scholars who believe in the authenticity, but haven't either argued for it or in some cases acknowledged it. And on the other side, the skeptics, there is Aeneas Wion, whose fantastic two-part article, L'histoire d'un vrai faux traité philosophique, I'd really recommend anyone to read. It's a real sort of tour de force of philological detective work. And then on another interesting variety of the skeptics are two scholars at Addis Ababa University, Binya Makonnen and Faisal Merawi, who claim that not only is the work a forgery for largely the same reasons as Wion and Conti Rossini, but it in fact gets in the way of studying the really vital sources of Ethiopian philosophy, which they locate in the writings of a 15th century heretical movement known as the Dakike Stephanos. In terms of prospects for the resolution of the debate, they are not great, but all we need to do is to find one manuscript from before 1852. New manuscripts are being discovered all the time. Many monasteries in northern Ethiopia have thousands and tens of thousands of texts that have never been explored. But unfortunately, the ongoing conflict in Tigray is making this significantly more difficult. So just a couple of sort of points to conclude on for what I think might be the lessons to take from this story. I think in either case, people can get too hung up on whether the work is African or it is European. I think in either case, the work is importantly hybrid. If it's written by a 17th century Ethiopian scholar, it's written by one who's in deep contact with traditions of European learning, from contact with the Jesuits, from perhaps reading earlier translations of Greek works, perhaps also from contact with Islamic sources. These are all things that need to be further explored. If it's written by Durbino, then it's a work which is significantly Ethiopian in that it's written in an Ethiopian language. It's written probably with the help and the assistance of Ethiopian scholars. It would have been good enough to pass as Ethiopian to the greatest scholars of Ethiopian culture for over 150 years. And I think in either case, if we really want to understand the text, we need this kind of connected analysis that I was suggesting before. The next question is, does it matter really who the author of the text is? Of course it matters politically. I'm not sure I mentioned before, but Conti Rossini, the guy who refuted or debunked the authenticity of the Hatäta, was, in addition to being a great scholar of Ethiopia, was an administrator of the Italian colony of Eritrea, and who at the same time as he was writing this was writing works entitled Ethiopia is Incapable of Civil Progress. And in another talk that I gave a couple of weeks ago, I tried to draw some links between his writings that deny philosophy to Ethiopia and put forward a justification of colonial domination. But nevertheless, he might have made the arguments for the wrong reasons, but philological demonstrations are fairly, they're in a lot of cases deductive and really. But anyway, so this is one reason that the debate might matter politically, but the question is, does it matter philosophically? And if we ask the question of whether the text is still philosophically rich, is it still ethically instructive, is it still true, perhaps it shouldn't matter nearly as much whether it was written in the 19th or 17th century by a European or by an African. And I mean, one reason that this has seemed important to people recently is because people want to use Zera Yacob as a way of diversifying the canon. And the worry is, of course, that if the Hatäta is written by D'Urbino and not by Zera Yacob, we don't expand the canon, at least in the way that we might have hoped. There won't be this foundational text of African philosophy, no indigenous Ethiopian philosopher to compare with his contemporaries in Paris or Baghdad or Delhi or Beijing. There won't be any sort of cultural capital to be accrued by saying, you know, we have our philosopher. But I think this really gets wrong what you know, any useful conception of expanding the canon should be about. And to get that, I want to sort of think about what the words on the page are. You know, there can be a kind of expanding of the canon, which is we have an African philosopher, which, you know, we would have had in Dwight's case today of talking about Anton Amo. We have you know, a philosopher from Africa who's doing European philosophy, whereas what we have here in a different case is philosophy done in an African language, possibly by a European. And I think that it's really interesting to look at the development of a philosophical vocabulary in this language, right? It seems that the philosophical vocabulary, a whole way of expressing philosophical concepts that never existed in that language before, kind of pops up, you know, out of nowhere. It's even more remarkable that that's the case if this is written by, you know, someone, you know, if this is written by D'Urbino. And I just think that it, you know, the canon is expanded regardless of who wrote this, because we have philosophy in a new language. You know, philosophy being written in this new language is going to enrich the language by making it sort of stretch out of place and find new concepts for new sorts of terms that it might not have had before. This would have already been going on in the translations of the Greek and Arabic works of philosophy into Gers. And of course, it's going to enrich philosophy by having these new terms, you know, by having a language which is, you know, expressing things in quite different ways than they would have been done before. And so, yeah, I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you very much. Great, we already have some questions in the chat. So Dan, why don't you go first?
Thank you very much, Jonathan, for really very fascinating, for a very fascinating talk. And I quite agree with what it is that you were saying, you know, in the end, even if, as a matter of fact, it was by an Italian Jesuit who was working in Ethiopia. Obviously, it's infused with the language, the culture, and it's a really, really interesting document. It would be interesting to know where it's from, but it's still a really interesting document that sounds like it's really worth studying. Question is, where do you put it? And I'm wondering whether, I mean, you're putting it with Descartes, who is basically the main person who it is that you were talking about, and you see that sometimes associated also with Locke and with a couple of other people, but with rationalism is what it is that you were putting it with. It seems to me that may not be the best context, European context, in which to put it. Descartes was, well, and we think of perhaps, or when you teach Descartes in university, you think of the meditations, you think of the cogito, you think of mind, you think of God and the theological questions. But Descartes was much more centrally in what we would think of as science, physics, mathematics, medicine, and so on. His was a reform program for all of the sciences, which were conceived in, you know, very much. Well, the sciences were conceived of very much in a European context. The figure that struck me as most interesting, perhaps for comparison, would be Montaigne. the idea of this as being sort of autobiographical, his reflections on the world and his reflections on what the world looks like from his point of view is very, very much what it is that Montaigne was after as well. Where do you put Montaigne anyway? You know, it's literature, it's philosophy. Pascal might be another interesting character to put it with. This suggests, I think, a different strategy for opening up the canon, including people like Montaigne and Pascal, as well as Zera Yacob, and perhaps also other non-European figures who are doing similar sort of philosophical literary projects. Would be that would be an interesting context in which to read it, perhaps.
Absolutely, I think. Yeah, and thanks so much for both of those suggestions. I think it definitely is true that some of the comparisons are, you know, especially with people like Descartes, can end up being a little strained, particularly when it does come to the things like the natural philosophy. There doesn't seem to me to be any counterpart in the Ethiopian case to that kind of systematic investigation of nature that's at the root of a lot of these other projects. That might be something that we find to not be the case in the future, but certainly the other. I think the Descartes comparison is just unavoidable for people because there's the question of doubt at the start, and then it's like, oh, okay, so it's going to be building this up, and then there's a kind of invocation of God to dispel some of the doubt. It's, this is even better, and then there's he talks about deception, and these all seem to fit in. But in terms of a general orientation of what the overall project is, I do think they're totally different, right? In terms of what I suggested, his problem being a fundamentally human one. How can humans live together? How can we dissolve these differences and these tensions?
That's exactly Montaigne. That's exactly Montaigne, as well as the doubt and the skepticism.
Yeah, no, I think that would be a really helpful route to look down, because, well, I mean, one of the other things is that obviously it's a philosophical autobiography. Two other obvious places to look are going to be Augustine and Rousseau, and I think there is quite a lot of Augustine in there. And one of the speculations that I make is, would it be impossible that works of Augustine or something would have been, would a Jesuit in Ethiopia have had a book of Augustine? Yeah, it's a real speculation, but maybe, and it only takes one particularly intelligent person reading one book that really sort of stirs them to be going down that route. But no, thank you very much for this the Montaigne suggestion. I'm looking into that.
Great, Justin.
Thank you, Jonathan. That was really a great talk. I don't want to colonize too much time because you and I have talked about all of these things before, except I will say I was really interested to hear what you had to say about Guarneri's work and how it suddenly became obvious to me that Guarneri's basic thesis in The Lost Age of Reason about, say, Navya Nyaya and the gradual kind of distancing from appeal to authority as a source of arguments in the context of Indian philosophy circa 1600, and a broader connected history of such a shift could explain in some measure why we're seeing such things in Ethiopia around the same time as well. Now, you know that I have inclined towards the skeptic camp and against the Jacobites, while I've always insisted that because I don't read Gez, I'm not going to make any real scholarly contribution on this point. But one of my reasons for skepticism has been the fishiness, let us say, of some of the Jacobite scholarship. Sumner is a very interesting person, but he's committed to a rather naive, romantic ideal of what Ethiopia represents. And I'll come back to that in a second. and other people like Dag Hammarskjöld's work, or no, not Dag Hammarskjöld, the other Dag, are clearly just writing in a vein of wishful thinking or of inversion of the standard narrative for the sake of inversion. And that's not interesting at all from a scholarly point of view. But that said, I did want to kind of confess that listening to you and reading some of the materials you've sent me recently, it seems to me that it's very plausible if we think, again, not of, let's say, Zara Yacob as in any sense the first of something, but rather as part of the same wave of radiation of a style of meditation that emerges in the previous century out of the Iberian Peninsula and has its shockwaves both in France and in Ethiopia, and perhaps in India too. That seems like a much more plausible way of understanding it. So I wanted to hear your comments on that, but also maybe just one quick observation, especially since Dwight isn't here today, about Amo and how the two fit together. Amo is frequently called an Ethiopian, and this is just sometimes kind of a metonymy, but also kind of a sign of the enduring meaningfulness in early modern Europe of the idea of Ethiopia, not just as, let's say, within the fold of philosophy, but actually the homeland of philosophy, you know, coming from the Heliodorus's novel in late antiquity, An Ethiopian Romance, where the Roman aristocracy sends their children to Ethiopia to study under the wise men of that philosophical kingdom. And this comes back again in this novel that Anton Ulrich of Wolfenbüttel writes called The Roman Octavia. He repeats this theme just before bringing Anton Wilhelm Amo into the Wolfenbüttel court, right? So around early modern Europe, there's this preoccupation with Ethiopia as a part, as again, within the fold of philosophy, very much unlike West Africa, the Gold Coast, where Amo comes from. It's a completely different cultural, geographical relationship to Ethiopia than it is to West Africa. So my thought now is, let's assume for the sake of argument, or let's exclude the hypothesis that it's Giusto d'Urbino, that it has a 19th century origin. Does this necessarily militate against the view that it could have been produced by Europeans still at an earlier date, who were themselves likewise preoccupied with Ethiopia and Ethiopic studies as part of philosophy?
Yeah.
And I'll stop there.
Yeah.
I could go on and on.
That's great, and I'd like to go on and on about it at some point. I'll try and answer them in reverse order, just because the vividness of the impressions, I suppose, are there the most. So on the last one about would it be possible that there were there was an earlier text than that, but done by Europeans? I mean, I guess so. We'd still have to answer the question of why there are no texts before 1852, and why the only two texts that we do have, people ask me a lot, why can't they just, carbon date or, do some paleographic analysis on the texts? Both of the 1852 ones were copied by d'Urbino and another Dabtara, who he was studying with. So I suppose some of the same questions would be there, but the question of the singularity wouldn't be there so much. But I don't think that the problem of singularity is as much of an issue as it might have been seen before. I think the one thing that Sumner does do very well, and that his knowledge of being in Ethiopia did allow him to do, is to say that there are plenty of, Ethiopia is not nearly as dogmatic as Conti Rossini might have thought. So there are all sorts of, there's blasphemous poetry, there's attacks on the authority of the king and the state in Ethiopian cases. I mean, is I guess what you had in mind, maybe, if the Jesuits who were there in the 17th century would have made an original composition, if there had been some, Portuguese Justo Urbino writing in the 1650s instead of the 1850s.
Yeah, as a possibility, or that this is a collective effort.
Yeah. I think that the collective effort idea is a really interesting one. And, on sheer weight of authority, the fact that Getachew Haile thinks that that is the case is an argument in favor of it. It's never been spelled out what exactly that might be. There's never been any suggestion of, oh, well, this part of the Hatäta may have come from this particular source, this bit may have come from this one.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't imagine that it would ever be possible to find out again unless manuscripts were found.
Mm-hmm.
On the previous one about the kind of the idea of Ethiopia and the fact that it had this very, it was seen very differently by Europeans in the early modern period to elsewhere. There's a couple of things. So one really interesting book that's come out has traced the history of Ethiopian Western European diplomacy in the sort of early modern, late medieval period. Where I think Ethiopian kings at one point sent 4 live leopards to the Doge of Venice.
Mm-hmm.
There were all kinds of these exchanges, but there's very little in that text about what the intellectual exchanges must have been.
Mm-hmm.
And Portuguese, the people who came to help the Ethiopians in this war against the Adal Sultanate, were generally very surprised when they found how poor and weak militarily and economically the country was when they got there. They were expecting that the lands of Prester John would be
right,
full of gold and bounty. But part of the reputation of Ethiopians as learned people may have come from Europe itself.
right.
So in the Vatican, there was St. Stephen's College of Ethiopians, where there was a scholar called Tafsa Seyon, who got the first books printed in Gers in Europe, who was a good friend of Pope Pius, that's it, one of Pope, and was engaged in all sorts of theological and scholarly controversies at the time. Martin Luther spoke with an Ethiopian scholar in Württemberg, I think, around the same time. And these were cases, of course, where the Ethiopians were being used for the kinds of scholarly debates that Europeans had at the same time. But there's a really interesting book that's just come out by Stanislaw Paulau as well on, I think it's about the influence of the thinking about the Orthodox Church for the Protestant Reformation. And it was very clear that the Ethiopian scholars who were there, who were talking to them, were highly respected by their interlocutors and had their own purposes for asking and figuring these things out.
Yeah.
And just the last one on the point of Ethiopian scholars in Europe, there was this guy Zaga Krestos, who was on one of those pictures I didn't stop to talk about, who was very good friends with Thomas Campanella in Paris, and who actually ended up dying in Cardinal Richelieu's apartments just outside of Paris after he'd been imprisoned for trying to empoison a woman's husband to run off with him. So, sorry, I don't remember what the second question was, or the first one. I don't remember.
It was more a cluster of remarks. I'm not sure I had 2 distinct questions. It had to do, well, I partially wanted to just address the issue of positioning Zara Yacob in relation to Amo and the question of canon expansion. And again, I would insist that it's a very important consideration. Even if you look at, say, the Russian scholarship from the late 19th century on Zara Yacob that we've talked about, he is not treated as as first and foremost an African. He's treated as someone who comes from within the historical fold of the Orthodox Church. And this is something that was so much more salient until very recently than the shared African identity that we take him to have with a West African like Amo today. But that's just a comment.
Yeah, well, I mean, it was traditionally much more important, and even in some cases still is today for many Ethiopians themselves.
Yeah.
That their identity as Habesha or as tied to the Orthodox religion, rather than, there's all sorts of forms of Ethiopian exceptionalism within the continent. But the Russian case that you mentioned there is interesting because, by the late 19th century, the Russians are the only ones really who would have thought of maybe Ethiopians primarily along those lines. Actually, were the only Europeans to support Ethiopia in the Battle of Adwa. There was a Russian detachment who sort of supplied a lot of the firepower.
Interesting.
I guess these are just historical tidbits, really. On the more sort of general question of canon expansion, I just think, yeah, the main question is that it's not just the author who's important. It's the words, and philosophy being written in a new language is much more remarkable, I think, than philosophy being written by a person from a different part of the world.
Jonathan, there might be more questions on this, so let's move on. So I have 4 more people on the list, right?
Yeah.
Denik, Hanok, Enrico, and Richard Starr. So Dennis?
Thank you for all the information about this philosopher. So since I don't know anything about him apart from the talk, I'll ask something about the reasoning that went into grouping him with the 17th century rationalists. To do so, I'll try to give an analogy which I think would not really work, so thereby also putting some of the stress on the argument to that grouping that you presented. Since rationalist is also already not the clearest category for 17th century European thinkers, I'll set that aside, but take occasionalists, which should be a bit more circumscribed. So in view of occasionalism, if we identify that we very narrowly as a kind of divine causation, a view of divine causation, is found in Al-Ghazali at the end of the 12th, 11th and beginning of 12th centuries. He has a lot of followers, not necessarily among philosophers, but also Kalam, who focus on the text of the Quran and the traditions of the prophets. Now, they do express views of divine causation later in the later centuries, similar to him. So take someone who lived in the 17th century in Istanbul who adopts a view of this sort. Now, we could say he's a 17th century occasionalist, but we wouldn't thereby put him into a frame that also makes sense of Malebranche. So the fact that he lived in the 17th century and the fact that this presumed person also adopts a view of divine causation, which has some similarity with that given it by Malebranche, does not suffice for putting him into a grouping which is fruitful for studying either Malebranche or for studying this person. So what I want to say is, as a result of reflection of this, one might think that groupings of thinkers need not be based only on doctrinal points, that they isolated doctrinal points and the century that they live in, but it should fit into what they read, what they're reacting to, and other things. So it isn't just the summation of time and narrowly circumscribed doctrine.
Yeah, absolutely. No, and I think, with any kind of proper name of rationalist in terms of, denoting people who read similar things, who argued in similar ways for similar things, this is not that at all. I suppose the idea I was trying to make, and I guess in calling it rationalist, like you said, it's a very baggy sort of term, and is there something in what I've just said that would make him closer to Spinoza and Leibniz and not to Hume and Reid? Does he agree with the principle of sufficient reason? No, to all of these things. I guess what I was trying to get at is, especially with the stuff I was saying about the connected history, is a similarity of style of response to particular sort of problems. So I suppose what I'm calling rationalist here is appealing to some sort of faculty of reason to solve some sorts of problems of human difference. I realize that's probably not what the Princeton-Bucharest Seminar on Learning Modern Philosophy would understand by these terms usually, but I was trying to be a little provocative with that in order to try and, you know, number one, to get at some suggestions like the one that Dan gave me of who I should be thinking about in relation to instead. And then secondly, for just thinking, like you said, if we're not thinking about the history of philosophy just in terms of, you know, thinking about who different people read, who people were in correspondence with, and the particularities that show, you know, close intellectual contacts, but in a, you know, in a way that's trying to include all sorts of different things that are going on in all sorts of different places that we might choose to call philosophy or we might not, and thinking about how these might arise out of problems that individual humans had. That's the kind of direction I was trying to go with it. So if it is a version of a history of philosophy, it's in a broadened and extended sense. But yeah, that's what I'm interested in at the moment.
Thank you, Jonathan. Hanok?
Thanks very much. Thanks for a very interesting, rich talk. Like you, I like to think about this connective history. The ideas don't pop up in the mind of a secluded individual. They must be exposed to these exchanges in culture. And if that's indeed what happened, he must be indebted to the Jesuit theologians, philosophers who were there then. I would have expected him to give some reference to them. Never mind a specific person, but refer to them as a group, refer to their ideas. The radical ideas of the 17th century Europe came mainly not from the Jesuits, but they might be a source for, you know, even if they don't adopt these ideas of delivering them to Ethiopia. But so that's one suggestion, question, whether there is any such reference to 17th century Jesuit theologians or philosophers in Ethiopia or in the books. Another thing, I think there is an interest in the, more than you suggested, in the author of the work, because, you know, Descartes sold us a myth of a philosophical methodology. You know, you sit in your, you lock the door, you sit in front of your oven, play with the wax and deliver and develop a wonderful system, which happens also to be much of it in Augustine and other people, but that doesn't matter. Now, Zera Yacob goes to a cave in the desert, disconnects from society, and develops his philosophy. This seems like a replay of the myth of a philosophical method that Descartes developed. Mm-hmm. So saying that in this way he developed his philosophy seems to buy that myth. Mm-hmm. And if it's a forgery, then this has some implications about the plausibility of such a methodology. Perhaps you should better be in contact with the best minds in Paris, with the Huygens, with the Beckman, and so on. And this is how you develop a philosophy, not in a cave. If you go to a cave, you just go mad and you do nothing. So there is an interest to it, I think. Okay, I stop here.
No, absolutely. Thanks very much for those questions. I mean, on the sort of point of the, you know, whether he acknowledges anyone else in the text. The only authorities he cites are Solomon and David. No other thinkers are acknowledged whatsoever. There might be, you know, there are political reasons why it wouldn't have been sensible to acknowledge individual Catholic or Jesuit thinkers at the time. There's the restoration of the Orthodox things afterwards. I think the only other individual noted by name other than the person who accuses him and the king is the Jesuit leader of the mission, Afonso Mendez, who comes after a while. But it does seem frustrating that there are no comments about anything at all. You know, if it was even the sort of mention, especially because these things do exist in other texts, right? In this Book of Wise Philosophers, things are attributed to Galen, to Socrates, to Plato. These are not unknown. I mean, the other thing to think is that if he is like Descartes in, you know, being this solitary thinker coming up with his ideas by himself, he might, like Descartes, be wary of giving anyone else too much credit for these other ideas he had. So in the same way that Descartes doesn't want to acknowledge Augustine, maybe he doesn't want to acknowledge, you know, Augustine or Aquinas or whoever else it is. And in terms of the point about being, you know, a solitary thinker in this way, you do get the impression that this is it's a bit of a myth that was come up with. So the text that formulates these ideas isn't written for another 60 years after he leaves the cave, maybe 50, something like that. And in one of the arguments that from Anais Rion that I mentioned before, she suggests that the whole metaphor of the cave is just the alter ego of Giusto d'Urbino, who's writing himself into this figure of Zera Yacob, the persecuted philosopher, the genius who's not appreciated by society, who's been sent into exile, and that his cave is in fact Urbino's study in Bethlehem, his small monastic cell where he reads and studies these texts and comes up with his philosophical work. So, and it's interesting the work that it does. I mean, in the Hjörbosrid, in the African Enlightenment article, in the headline and repeatedly in the thing, a lot of it is made of the fact it was an individual in a cave, right? The fact that he was in a cave is supposed to be important. He's by himself. He's really playing up to this myth of the solitary thinker. And yeah, I just think that more generally, there's, you know, that there are all sorts of ideas of thinking about Ethiopian intellectual life as being like that, as, you know, more generally, Ethiopia is this cave, is this mountain fastness disconnected from all of these other places. And if we want to understand Zera Yacob, we're not going to understand that there was this, you know, indigenous genius who happened to come up with these genius thoughts in a cave. The connections are going to be what gives us the key, you know, both in the case of the individual text and for the society at large. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
May I continue a little, Claudia? Even if he doesn't mention a person by name, apart from David and Solomon, and one more person you mentioned, he might mention groups of people. And if he criticizes, you know, ideas he was exposed to, he could say these Jesuits arrived in our country with their ideas, but they were as confident in their ideas as those coming from the north were confident in theirs, and etc. etc. So we can refer to groups of people, and if it doesn't do that, then this might indicate some ignorance of the history of the time. So if I were to make such a forgery, then and I happen to be ignorant of the history, I would be very cautious from mentioning. I would be very abstract in what I say.
Yeah.
So if this is the nature of the text, that's again some reason to suspect its authenticity.
Absolutely, and that's absolutely not the case. He's very specific with groups of people, and we talked about this. So there was the quote I had at the start about the Copts say this and the Ferenc say this. These are not national or racial designators. They're essentially religious ones. The Copts are simply the Orthodox scholars. The Ferenc are simply the Catholic scholars. And we know this because he says, you know, they used to take me for a Ferenc, and obviously you wouldn't take him for being a Ferenc in the other sense. So he refers to those specific people. He refers to being called before he's initially expelled in front of the king to defend himself. And the king says, why do you not respect the wisdom of the Ferenc? For they are so wise and have brought so many ideas to our country. And he, you know, says, yes, the Ferenc are very wise, and please let me go now, and runs off. But those aren't the only groups he refers to. So he has has some understanding of what the law of Moses with its despicable wisdom and all of that really says. That's partially because there is according to some historians at least, an independent Jewish state of some sort of the Beta Israel community around Lake Tana at this point. There are many Muslims in Ethiopia. They run just about all of the trade. He's got an understanding of that. He refers to the religion of the Hind, of the Indians, as having different things to say. I think he has some understanding that that's polytheistic. And in the companion treatise afterwards, he mentions 4 or 5 other nations, which are most the Sabaeans and I can't remember what the other one is, of South Arabia. And on historical details, it's incredibly accurate and really on point. He has the correct year that the Jesuit priests came over there. He has the year of the fall of the emperors and the large battles. It's very important as a historical document. It's initially why Dabadi was interested in it. The question of whether D'Urbino could have known that information as well, he probably could. He probably could have read the same things about the Jesuit mission. He would have certainly known how the Jesuit mission that was around Zera Yacob's time would have ended. It ended very badly. They were exiled to a desert in Fremona where they all died with the few people they'd managed to convert. But it's interesting, but it doesn't seem telling either way with the authenticity.
Thanks very much. Very helpful and informative.
Thank you.
Thank you both. Enrico is not here anymore, I think, so we can move on to Richard.
Well, first of all, thank you for an absolutely wonderful talk. Some of what I wanted to say has already been suggested. I want to very much second Dan's suggestion that Montaigne is a relevant figure, especially in terms of the hatred of religious conflict and of religious certainty, because this is so much the fundamental position of Montaigne. Is that I mean, he's writing in the middle of the French Wars of Religion. People are literally killing themselves and each other's and their brothers, and their families are split over these dogmatic matters. And Montaigne is horrified and thinks that this just can't be the right way to conduct social or religious life. So that passage where he talks about how wicked religious conflict is just could have been written by Montaigne, and so that's just emphasizing, underlining that point. But that leads me to another interesting comparison, is that there's wonderful work by a scholar, a woman named Rivi Handler Spitz, on a Chinese philosopher whose name I'm not going to pronounce properly, but I say Lizhi. It's Lizhi is how it's normally transliterated, and who she thinks is a remarkable parallel to Montaigne without any direct knowledge of each other, of course. But again, it's the kind of thing of similar circumstances, competing dogmatisms, etc. And so her work on Liege and Montaigne, I think, would be very apropos to your own, and you would love it. It's wonderful stuff. And she's also just published recently a collection of translations of Liege's essays. So you can now read the stuff in translation. The other thing I wanted to say, and picks up a little bit on what Hanak was saying, the one thing that I found a little discordant in the talk was the idea that the Jesuits could get you to Prisca Theologia, because that's just not where those guys are going. Those guys are absolutely dedicated to Mother Church, and that Mother Church is right about everything. And one of the little appendices that Ignatius adds to the spiritual exercises is a line about if the church says black is white, you have to believe it. And practically in those words. So whatever influence the Jesuits had, it wouldn't be pushing towards general rationalism of the Herbert of Cherbury, et cetera, sort. So I thought that was the one little moment where I kind of got off the train. So I guess those are the things that I wanted to say or suggest.
Well, yeah, thanks very much for all of that, especially this Ligi thing. I'm really excited to follow up. I have a good friend who's interested in the Zera Yacob and quite probably knows a lot more about this than me, and especially if it's this case of, similar. I keep calling them material circumstances.
Scholar is Rivi, R-I-V-I, Handler hyphen Spitz. Rivi Handler Spitz is the one.
Perfect. I've got that now. As for the Theologia point, the my understanding of where that had come from was, it's essentially one side of the rights controversy, that you have some people saying we need to do things by the book, the way that Rome says it, and on the other hand, people saying that, well, ultimately, their ancestor worship is compatible with this because it's all part of the same thing ultimately, which is, I don't know if that counts. This is. Is there another sort of alternative Jesuit side of things? Because one of the things I really want to look into in the future is whether there are other cases of interactions like the one that may have happened with Zera Yacob, where you have indigenous scholars or people who are interested in this coming into contact with the Jesuit thought and producing these kind of hybrid works at all. I would imagine that scholars of Chinese philosophy might have some things to say about that, but I'm not sure. But yeah, maybe I'm happy to just concede that point. I
think what's interesting about the Jesuits, on the one hand, they're admirable, they're translating, they're learning the languages, and on the other hand, their sole goal is conversion.
Yeah. I came across something yesterday where they were getting very annoyed because the Ethiopians banned them from using their churches because they wouldn't stop spitting on the floor. Thank you for that.
It seems strange for that to be the last thing in the talk. So I think I'm just going to ask Enrico's question, which was whether the fact that this is a biography is in any way thematized within the text itself. Does he discuss the very fact of writing about himself?
Sorry, it cracked up.
Yeah. So Enrico's question was whether the very fact of biography is mentioned in the biography, whether he talks about I'm writing about myself in any special way. So is it like a stage biography, or it's just?
Yeah. So there's a colophon at the start which says this text was assembled by Walter Hayward, the disciple of Zera Yacob in year, whenever it was. The thoughts that are contained in this are written by him himself or something like that, and then he launches into that. And towards the end, there's another little bit which kind of frames it, which is to say that Zera Yacob died at the grand old age or whatever, surrounded by his loving family and all of this sort of stuff. It's quite nice that the closing sections of the book, after he sort of goes off to the cave, has this completely solitary way of thinking about things. He really advocates a fairly normal life. He advocates a family, hard work, not too hard, but enough to have everything, community life as being very important. And after the wars, he goes and he starts a family. He's lives in this one place, being a scribe and teaching a couple of pupils until he dies. And that's so it's stated at the start, and it's a sweet ending actually to a book that sounds like it's very sad at the start.
Thank you. Okay, well, that's a good note on which to end. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you, Jonathan, for the talk. Next week, we will have Dana, Sorana, and Paul Lodge talking about Irado next week. So that will be a different thing for our seminar. Okay, well, thank you and have a great week, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.